In 2013, Naughty Dog released arguably one of the most critically acclaimed video games of all time, The Last of Us. Originally on PlayStation 3. It was a game that found its way onto dozens of Game of the Year lists, that actors in the game won Best Performance Awards. It has long been considered a pinnacle of what a video game can be. And I think in the last 9 or so years since its release, as well as its sequel and now its re-release, it's interesting to look back on a game that at no time in playing it again in The Last of Us Part 1, its remake, have I ever thought, well, this is really dated, or, it may have worked back then, but it doesn't really work now. The Last of Us Part 1 is the latest release from Naughty Dog. It is a complete remake of the original The Last of Us, a game that came out at the very end of the PlayStation 3's lifestyle. In fact, when The Last of Us came out, it was just before the PlayStation 4 was announced. The PlayStation 4 came out later that fall. And it's really funny to think, when the original game was released, a lot of people thought, why do we need new consoles? This is fine. It's so funny to look at side-by-sides of the original game and this remaster, because we clearly didn't know what we were missing. I want to talk about The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us in general. The question, of course, that many people have is a remake not only necessary, but is it worth it? That's a good question. One I think that is pretty obvious. So The Last of Us was this really interesting game. It intentionally wanted to be kind of more than a game. Naughty Dog up until that point had really only been doing, arguably fun games. Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter, and Uncharted. Uncharted was sort of their true breakout series. It was one of the most popular game series of the PlayStation 3. Uncharted 2 was considered, before The Last of Us, to be the best game ever made. And I think a lot of people were not expecting a game like The Last of Us to come out. And in fact, Naughty Dog themselves didn't really seem to know what they were getting. Bruce Straley, one of the co-creators, along with Neil Druckmann, said that they were kind of risking a lot to put The Last of Us out there, because it was a completely different game from what Naughty Dog had been doing. It was a game that really was not kind of their traditional style. It was not their traditional tone. And it was something that they were really kind of coming out of left field to present to people. And in fact, it was in no way what the second team at Naughty Dog were intending to start out doing. They were originally going to make a Jak and Daxter reboot. But when they found there wasn't that much, support within the team, they decided against it. So The Last of Us was released in 2013 to what I remember as little fanfare. I don't remember the game being announced or even released. And in fact, I only found it after it had been released, and I watched one review, and one review said it is the most brutal and violent game that they've ever played, and it's beautiful and incredible. And I said, well, then that's it. I like Naughty Dog. I like Uncharted. I'm buying this game. And I like so many other people, I started playing. It looked amazing. I still distinctly remember how incredible I thought the original Last of Us looked. And even, genuinely looking at it now in its contemporary, comparisons, it was a very visually impressive game. And to watch, it opened up incredibly peacefully. There's a girl on the couch and this guy comes home. It's a very peaceful and very simple opening. But like everyone else who has played the game, within 20 minutes, you realize this is a very heavy game. And this is a game that it's probably going to break your heart a little bit. And I was immediately hooked. I immediately loved it. I played through it immediately, thought it was incredible, thought it was beautiful, thought it was heartbreaking, thought it was exciting and scary. It was a horror game in a sense. And I just loved it. I played it through on my PlayStation 3, and then when I had a PlayStation 4, I got it for PlayStation 4 and played it again on the remastered. And just before The Last of Us Part 2 came out, played it again. Well, actually, that's not true. The Last of Us Part 2 was released in June of 2020. Now, in about February of 2020, something happened globally. Some little pandemic broke out, and I was in a comfortable position. I was safe, and things were okay, so I wasn't necessarily worried in that sense. But of course, anxiety being at what it is, when this game was coming out, I said, "Well, I'm gonna play the first game to catch up to the story and to refresh my memory of The Last of Us." And I remember playing the opening. Oh, it was heartbreaking. Sarah dies, and it's very sad. And then The Last of Us has an opening credits sequence where it shows these growing fungus, which is actually real footage, by the way. It's not digital. It's completely real time-lapse footage of fungus growing from a laboratory. And this voiceover of news reports of all of the news reports of the essentially the collapse of society. And it was things like, as this pandemic continues to spread, and the WHO now has to deal with the fact that their vaccines aren't working, and, everything is falling apart and everything is terrible. And, just looking around at the world we were living in, I put my controller down and said, no, I don't think I need that today. But I kind of wish I had, because that was really an incredible opportunity to play the games side by side. I think that The Last of Us Part 2 really put into perspective how old The Last of Us was and is. It is an almost 10-year-old game, and there's always a question as to when is too soon to remake or remaster a game, and some may say 10 years is way too soon. But also remember, we got a remaster of the original game, I think less than a year after the original game was released. So too soon is not really something that Naughty Dog or Sony really cares about. And so when they announced The Last of Us Part 1, or when it was leaked, I think a lot of us had similar feelings as we had when Part 2 was announced, which was, do we really need this? I mean, when Part 2 was announced, I distinctly remember thinking Part 1 was so perfect. It ended on such a perfect note. I don't think we need to go back. I don't think that we need to re-examine this story or re-examine these relationships. It ended on such a perfect place to say, it's a little ambiguous. It's a little bit foggy as to whether or not Ellie believes Joel in his lie, or is she just sort of choosing to believe what he says is true, because otherwise how can you live with a person or live around a person who has lied so egregiously? So she's sort of accepting a truth, but we don't necessarily know for sure. And so that ambiguity was kind of beautiful. And so when Part 2 was announced, I think a lot of us, at least I can speak for myself, were thinking, I don't know if we need that. Of course, at least in my opinion, I was completely wrong at that assumption that the Part 2 was brilliant and it was a story that absolutely needed to be told. But I felt a very similar feeling with the announcement of Part 1. Do we need a remake of this game? The original game is still very, very good. And of course, I think a lot of us were sort of working off of our memory of this game. Not necessarily what it really was, but what we remember it being and what we think it should have been, or even more than that, when we do play it and we do find faults in its design or its graphics or how it runs or whatever, we sort of forgive it because, well, it was so important back then and it's such a great legacy game. And I think that we also we have to put into perspective where The Last of Us lives, or where it lived in 2022, which is, it was essentially, it wasn't really a resurgence, but it was sort of this ongoing interest from part 2 that became very popular. But also there was an HBO show coming out from the creators of Chernobyl and Naughty Dog. They were working together with Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, and they were going to make this incredible HBO show of The Last of Us. And that was going to introduce a vast audience to this game that may have never played it before. I'm a little skeptical as to that claim, honestly, because when you think about it, The Last of Us Part 1 is only available on PlayStation 5. So if you have a PlayStation 5, it's very likely that you know what The Last of Us is, and you probably have played it, or you at least seen it, or you've heard about it, or you've played Part 2. So I feel like this audience of who've never played it before and who would be introduced to it by a TV show, and then they'll go to their PlayStation 5s that they already have but don't really know a lot of, Sony games. But whatever, that anybody can, it's for everybody, I suppose. But it was one of those things where, okay, you're a legacy player of this game, a player who has played every version of it and has played it on all the consoles that it's available on. Is it a game that we need? Is it a game that is necessary? And I think that was a difficult thing that I'm sure Naughty Dog thought about. I hope they thought about. And then, of course, the bigger question: is it worth $70? That was a big sticking point. I think that was their biggest mistake, honestly, before we even get into what the game was and how it was to play. Charging $70 for a game that it has already been developed and already been released twice, and people have already played it. I understand an argument to say, well, it's a new game. It's completely redesigned. It's completely reimagined not reimagined, but completely rebuilt from the ground up. I understand that takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, it takes money. It takes a lot of money for a studio to say, we're going to completely rebuild this game, this very complex and long game. The Last of Us is like 15 hours long. That's a big game. And I understand that to say it takes a lot of resources. But my problem with that is that you're not developing a completely new game, you're redeveloping an old game. So you already have the concepts, you already have the level designs, you already have the character designs, you already have all the acting, you already have all the performances. Yes, you have to reanimate them, but you also don't have to, record them. You don't have to figure out how to make, the enemies work. That sort of iterative and experimental development that happens in video game development, where you build something, you see if it works, if it doesn't work, you try something else. That happens in every game. It happened in The Last of Us. It happens in all facets of video games. It's just part of it. Well, that wasn't really necessary when developing Part 1, because all that was already done. It was done 10 years ago when they developed it originally. So yeah, I mean, there's a defense of the $70, but there's also sort of the indefensible of the $70. You're not doing the same work it took back then. And of course you can say, well, for inflation, it's actually cheaper than the original game. Okay, yeah. But there's also not the online component. There's no factions. So, there's a scale, there's a weight, there's a good and the bad, and it all comes down to, is it worth it to you? So the biggest question is, how does it play? What's better? What's worse? What's important? The Last of Us was a game that so many people loved and played. Do they need to play it again? So the first thing that is wildly improved, of course, is the facial animations, the characters. I did not know how blank the original game character faces were. When Joel is yelling at Tess, when Ellie is scared at Joel, and whatever. I did not realize how little they were emoting, because it's all we knew, right? It's all we had. There's nothing to compare it to. But then you play Part 2 and you go, wow, look at the advancements that Naughty Dog has been able to develop. And then you play Part 1 and you go, wow, it was really bad back then. It was really not great. And it's very funny to think about that. But at the same time, you kind of go, this really is going to be far more emotional. One of the biggest things about The Last of Us, I would not put The Last of Us's gameplay on a pedestal. I think Part 2 has far more complex and advanced and nuanced gameplay. Part 1's gameplay is very simple. It's got very simple stealth, it's got very simple combat, it has very simple, UI, it has very simple menus, all that stuff, upgrades and things like that. It's all very... They did not reinvent the wheel here. Especially in 2013, this was all... It was very well done, without a doubt. It was very well done, but it was not... They did not fix anything that had already existed within, video game development. They did not have a feature that was like, oh my gosh, this is so brilliant. Not the way that you could argue Part 2 had, which was it had a very smart AI system. They had various enemies and various things like that to work with. But even Part 2 did not introduce, gameplay elements that were so revolutionary and so incredible that you couldn't believe it. Part 1's, or the original Last of Us, same thing. It did fine. It did very well. But it was not something that I would say is, incredible. So without groundbreaking gameplay, I think the thing that set The Last of Us apart was, without a doubt, its story and its performances. And I think that has always been the thing that makes The Last of Us a game that sticks out, at least for me. It's a game that I remember the emotional beats. It's the game where I remember scenes. I don't remember that many scenes from other games. And people have always argued that Naughty Dog is a movie-making developer that puts some gameplay elements in the middle of it, but they make movies, more or less. And, that's a fair argument, really. Some of their cutscenes are 10 minutes long, and that's a fair argument. But I think what those cutscenes do is they do present the story in such a way with the gameplay that it's such an experience to play through it. And so I would say that when you have a game that their number one feature is the story and the performances, what Part 1 is able to do is it's able to take those performances, which back then we thought were brilliant, and bring them to a modern animation style, to a modern animation ability. It's genuinely jaw-dropping to look at it and to watch these characters emote in a way that they never had before. To watch Joel yell at Tess, and when he yells at Tess, there's a little bit of spit that comes out of his mouth. When Tommy is talking to Joel and saying, I can't do this. What are you talking about? The look in his eyes is just so... It's kind of heartbreaking because it's almost this it's his brother and he doesn't even know what to say. There's so much of that. Watching, Marlene, when she's begging for her life, it hurts so much more, not only knowing how she feels from Part 2, but also just seeing that on the character model is far more heartbreaking and engaging and powerful. And I think that this is completely true with Ellie and Joel. Ellie and Joel, of course, being the main characters of this game. It is astounding how much we didn't see. Watching Ellie pour her heart out in front of Joel, watching her say, I've lost people and I was always scared, and if you think I'll be better off with Tommy, you're wrong. I'll just be more scared. I mean, that scene, the You're Not My Daughter scene, that's always been, I think, what makes The Last of Us not just a better game. It makes it the game it is, right? It makes it the game that we all know is not just impressive, but it's groundbreaking. That's the groundbreaking part. It's a game that presents itself in such a serious way that a scene like that is so powerful, especially in the moment it's in. It's sandwiched between combat, but we've been so far down this road. And I think that we are as much Joel as anything, where we know we should probably give her to Tommy, and Tommy will be better with her. But at the same time, we don't really want to do that, but we know that's probably the best. And to hear Ellie basically say, You just wanted to dump me like everybody else, and you as the player are almost reaching through the screen. No, I love you, but I can't do this, or it's just so powerful and just incredible. And Ashley Johnson's performance in that moment is just it's you want to give her a hug and just say, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. But also Troy Baker, who they both bring so much to these characters. But that line, "You're not my daughter," is such a that's such a it just hits you so hard, because we know how much that means, that line, "You're not my daughter," and it means so much. It's such an insult, really, because also he kind of knows that there's this image of Sarah in his mind, as Joel, in his mind, that almost doesn't really exist, but it did at some point. Who knows how Sarah would have lived in this world? He lost her right at the beginning of this whole thing, of this apocalypse, and he sort of calloused over from that moment on. He became this person who would never want to accept anybody else even close to him. And yet this girl almost kind of did, but no, it's better before that even happens to just send her away, go with Tommy, you can do it. And they're both sort of fighting this reality of like, we are good together. We work well together. We protect each other. We watch each other's backs, and we like each other. We get along, which is very rare in this world. And so that scene sort of is the culmination of all that, right? That's what this game is. That's the value of The Last of Us, beyond the gameplay, beyond the elements that are not as great. As I said, the gameplay is not groundbreaking. It's the story that is. And it's the way that the story is told. It's not told in a way that sort of puts it underneath and says, yeah, it's a serious story, but no, the gameplay is really, really cool. It says, no, the story is the game. That's why we're telling a story here that just so happens to be a video game, right? It's storytelling, not game telling, which is really, really different in a sense from what a lot of other developers were doing. And it's something that I think that sets The Last of Us apart, even from The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 has far more, gameplay moments that I remember. I still remember storytelling moments from The Last of Us Part 2, but I remember far more gameplay set pieces, kind of like how Uncharted had a lot of set pieces. The Last of Us said, no, strip all that away. Just tell the story in such a way that it'll break your heart, and they do a very good job. And to have advanced animation techniques is beyond good. It genuinely brings this game life that it never really had. It gives it life that they only ever really dreamed of it having. And it's genuinely, you watch scenes like that, you watch the cutscenes and you go, okay, yeah, I get it. I really do get it. This is not just worth it. This was kind of necessary in a lot of ways. Again, that's up to your interpretation, but I think that it changes the way that the game, it's no longer just the audio, it's the visual, it's everything, and it's vital. Another thing that is improved, another thing that is better, I think, is not just the animations, the lighting. The Last of Us had a lot of cheats to make the lighting look good. What's really interesting to look at how older games were made before they could make sort of in-game engine effects was how they were able to manipulate certain elements to make it look like something was happening, but actually nothing was actually happening. So one of the ways that The Last of Us did this originally was with lighting. A lot of elements in The Last of Us are artificially lit. Now, everything in a video game is artificially lit, that is true. But in games today, many games today, I should say, there is a quote-unquote real light source in the scene that lights the area. And that is true for so many engines nowadays where there's not that many, again, quote-unquote, artificial light sources. I mean, it's a video game. Everything is artificial. But in the original Last of Us, what they had to do was essentially make up different lights in different places to make it look natural. Because there was no way in 2013, 2012 when they were developing it, but in 2013, to make lights actually act like light in a video game. There was no way to do that. And this is all for gameplay. In cutscenes, you can make it look like whatever you want because it was pre-rendered. But in gameplay, they had to, especially in certain specific situations where they wanted a certain effect. So in one case, when you're walking through Bill's town, where the sun's sort of setting and it's really beautiful and there's sort of light and all this stuff, and it's a very impressive visual. In the original game, none of that really existed. They just made it look like it existed using various tricks of the trade. In part 1, it is essentially real. It is a legitimate light source that then through, ray tracing and other techniques is able to, subsurface scattering on the skin and different scattering techniques in various elements and objects around the world. The light is more or less real. And you can see this real mistakes come in the form of windows in the original Last of Us. The windows were more just a light source. So even if the sun on the outside of the building is coming from one direction, the windows, the light's coming from the opposite direction because the window is just a light source, not a directional light source. Again, in part 1, they make it as real as possible so that the light sources match what the real sun is doing. So it's little things like that you don't even notice it. And that's the point. It's the magic of the tech that makes it work. If you don't notice it, that means it's working. And it just sets the scenes in such beautiful light, and it just makes it feel so cohesive. And the same is true for the fact that the cutscenes themselves are rendered in real time. So there is no jarring difference between what the game looks like when you're playing it versus what the game looks like when you're watching a cutscene. And this was, one of the biggest issues with the original Last of Us and what part 1 kind of fixes. Part 1, it just smoothly goes from gameplay to cutscene. The original Last of Us, there was a black screen for just a second, and then the cutscene would start. And the cutscene was beautifully lit. It was beautifully rendered. It was absolutely gorgeous, and it was perfect. And the gameplay just didn't quite match that, especially the lighting. And so the lighting in this remake it's brilliant, and it adds a cohesive nature to every element of the game. Everything feels like it's part of the same world. It feels like you're not just walking through gameplay elements, then cutscene, then gameplay, then cutscene. It feels like it's all one long moment. It doesn't cut as much as other things would look like. Other things that are improved, there is now workbenches for Joel to actually do things on his guns as he improves them, as he upgrades them, just like in part 2. This is a neat little feature. It adds that extra little bit of realism. It adds that extra little bit of time it takes to upgrade a weapon, and that's a very worthwhile, in my opinion, a very worthwhile addition. It's fun to see Joel actually pick up tools. When he finds a tool, it's an actual tool. It's a file, or it's a pliers, or it's something like that. And so it just, again, adds to that realism, and it's those little things, it's the little details that make it work. Other little things that are very important, but I think have improved the game massively, are improved controls. Not much has really changed, but everything's a little bit tighter. Everything is a little bit smoother, and I think this is not only a benefit of having the benefit of 10 years of development on controlling a character. Naughty Dog has definitely made Joel far easier to control. Another thing I want to talk about very specifically, I know I've already spoken a little bit about improved animation, but also with the advanced detail that we're seeing in this remake, we're seeing improved character models from not just Ellie and Joel, obviously, but every other character feels so much more real and natural, and it actually helps the story in this sense. And specifically, I'm talking about Tess. In the original release and in actually the remaster as well, it doesn't improve. Tess looks really, at least to my eye, young. She looks like 25 to Joel's 50. And so there's that moment where Tess is bit and she tells Joel and Ellie to go, and Joel says, "No, we're not going to do that." And Tess says, "Look, if there's something between us, if there's anything ever between us, now is the time to show that. This is when you have to leave." I understood what she was essentially saying, which is that if they're, maybe they had a fling a couple years back, but it's not really there anymore. But they had feelings for each other at one point. It felt kind of icky because Joel was so old and Tess was so young. But now, I think it's much clearer that Tess is far more closer to Joel's age than to Ellie's, really. And it informs the character that Tess is as worn and battle-hardened as Joel is. She's as old as Joel, and so they are far more equally matched. They are far more equally compatible. So that line especially, if there's something here, if there's anything between us, this is how you show it. That line works much, much better. And this is true for other characters as well. Bill is a far more real-looking person, and there's so much more in his face and in his character now that it all comes out in this remake. It's really quite interesting to see the difference between these two characters from the original release to this remake. It adds so much depth to this person, and it makes him look so much more lived and worn. And this is true as well for Ellie and Joel. One of the things that I was a little concerned about with part 1 was that Part 2 had actually kind of changed the shape of Joel's face when they did those flashback scenes. And I understand exactly why they did this. They did it because, in Part 1, they didn't have facial capture. They had to hand animate everything, so the performances would just then be translated into the character models. But in Part 2, they were doing facial capture, and it's not that easy to just copy and paste an actor's movements on their face with their own specific face structure and just copy and paste it into any old character model. It doesn't always translate very well. And so by changing the character model ever so slightly, Joel got a little bit of a longer face, kind of like Troy Baker's, and Ashley Johnson's rounded face kind of went into Ellie's face, so her face got a little bit different. And so it turned into, they started to look a little more like their actors, which is not necessarily a bad thing. They still look like Ellie and Joel. But they also brought those changes over into Part 1, and I was a little bit concerned because one of the things that I really thought was impressive about Joel's character's design was how brooding and rough and difficult he looked. And I was a little bit concerned that taking a little bit away of his square jaw and a little bit more of his square, boxy face would kind of soften him a little bit too much. What I found was kind of interesting is it kind of did soften Joel a little bit, almost from the get-go. But what it really did was it showed me the bags under his eyes. And it showed me the sadness in his face. This isn't necessarily a guy who's happy that he is a hulking, brooding, angry guy. This is a guy who is just living for the sake of, I'm not dead yet. And so I feel like it added so much more character to him, and it makes him a little bit more of a tragic figure. And that was something I was entirely not expecting. Something I was expecting, and I was very happy to see it, was the incredible score and incredible sound design of this game. I think we all agree that Gustavo Santaola's score for The Last of Us is one of the most impressively tragic and devastating scores in video games. And to hear it again is just amazing. And it really, again, adding to everything, combining the score with now the improved visuals and the improved lighting and also the improved and remastered sound effects and the improved and remastered vocal performances, the recordings. it all comes together in this really impressive package of just, it's cleaner, it's sharper, it's together in such a way that is really quite, it's really impressive, and it's really something that I had a lot of fun playing, that I didn't necessarily expect to have fun. I thought it would be a game that I played before and I'm playing it again. That's not really true. Playing The Last of Us Part 1, having only played, obviously The Last of Us and The Last of Us Remastered, it was really quite impressive to be introduced to all these improvements and to think, wow, I thought it was good before, but they made it even better. All that being said, I do want to point out a couple things that did bother me. But the biggest things that actually really bothered me was that they didn't bring some things over from Part 2 to Part 1. Namely, there's no going prone, there's no knife. Joel doesn't have a switchblade the way that Ellie does. And there's also no dodging. These are elements that, I completely understand why they didn't come over. The combat arenas were not designed for Joel to be able to lay on his stomach and crawl around through. Same thing, the internal logic is that Joel's a big brutish man. He can't dodge the way Ellie can dodge. And, Ellie has a switchblade because it's in her story that she has a switchblade, and Joel can't just have a switchblade. And so those elements are a little bit... I'm missing those elements. I wish we were able to see those things brought back in some form, some fashion, especially dodging, because that is sorely missed. I remember playing for the first time going, okay, dodge. Oh, I can't do that. That's not good. So those little things, it makes you kind of miss them if you're coming from Part 2, but you do get over it pretty quickly. And I think my biggest complaint about this game, and it is a massive, massive oversight, and I think that I am going to ask for a refund because of it. In the original The Last of Us, remastered actually, because the DualShock 4 controller was the first controller to have a little speaker in it. A neat little feature that no game has ever really used. And when you clicked your flashlight on, there was a little click sound coming from your controller, like you were holding your flashlight. It was the greatest little thing. And when Part 2 came out, they did not bring that feature over. I was incredibly disappointed. But I let it go. It was a new game. And in this remastered game, they did not bring that feature. The flashlight does not click through the controller. 0 out of 10. I hate this game. That's not true. I really like this game. I do. I'm actually quite surprised at how much I do like The Last of Us Part 1. And I knew that I would appreciate the game in general. I have a general adoration for The Last of Us. So, theoretically, I like The Last of Us Part 1. But on principle, is it worth $70 for a game that I've already bought twice, that I've played countless times? Is it worth that price tag? And I think I can answer that question pretty simply, and that is not really. The Last of Us is a brilliant game. It really is. It's just one of those games that I think we will be playing for quite a while. It is a simple story, essentially. And it is told so well, and it's performed so well, that you don't even need these advancements in animation, in texture design, and all these other things. You don't need those to tell the story as well as you can. And we know this because we've played the game stripped away of all of that. The Last of Us was released almost 10 years ago with none of those things. And it was still groundbreaking in its storytelling, in its presentation, and it was still brilliant. And so, by that simple definition, no, you don't need to spend any more money on this game if you already own it. But if you've never played it, or you've only played Part 2, you need to play it this way. If you've only ever played Part 2 because, oh, well, it's the new game and it's got a little controversy around it, so I'm just going to play it and it was great, and now you have a PlayStation 5 and you want to play the first game, somehow you haven't, then yeah, this is the way to play it, 100%. To go from part 2 to part 1 is going to be jarring. But for returning people, for people who have played this game multiple times, for people who have bought this game multiple times, I still think, and I think this is going to be the ultimate, little spot on this release and on The Last of Us Part 1 in general. $70, I think, is just too much. This is a $50 game. Plain and simple. It's an incredible game. It's incredibly well done. It's a lot of fun in a way that is not, fun, but, it's a horrifyingly brutal game. But it's incredibly exciting and heartbreaking and really well done. But if you've played it before, you've played it before. And when it goes on sale or something, that's when to buy it. But again, I think that's the biggest negative that this game could have, is that it was launched at $70. I know that's how new games are being priced. I understand that, but I just don't think it's worth that for a returning player. New players, sure. Returning players, I don't think so. What I think The Last of Us Part 1 does, and what it really needed to do, is it needed to unify The Last of Us with The Last of Us Part 2. I think it's actually quite smart that they called this remake simply Part 1, by not only combining the titles in a sense of continuity, but now their continuity is continued through the visuals. There's a lot of games out there who have sequels that came years and years later, and the visuals of the original game just don't match up with the new game, and they just are left that way. And in a lot of cases, the sequel is far better received or is far more popular than the original game. And so the original game is sort of forgotten. It's sort of, left to the wayside. Yes, that's what started this whole thing, but we really are focusing on the future. But The Last of Us isn't really like that. And I think that was clear from the moment they announced The Last of Us Part 2. There's a specific reason why it's not called The Last of Us 1 and The Last of Us 2. Because it's not really two stories, it's one story, and they just had to divide it into two different games. It's a long story about Joel and Ellie and Abby, and it has to be told in two parts, and that's why this Part 1 was so necessary to Naughty Dog. They had to unify these stories. They had to unify these games in such a way that it made it so that it felt natural to play one and then directly to play the next one. And I think that by remaking this game, you couldn't have done all these things with just another remaster, with just improving textures, with just improving animations. By completely rebuilding from the ground up all of the systems that made Part 2 so technologically advanced and putting them all in to Part 1, it creates a continuity that even if there is no Part 3, which we have no idea, The Last of Us series will, I think, be one of the most impressive video game series of all time. Whether you love the second one or not, I think that you have to accept it as part of this story. And it's a difficult part, but it's a part nonetheless. So overall, The Last of Us Part 1 is a game that I don't think anybody was really expecting. I don't think that many people wanted. But I think now that we have it, and it's out there, and we've played it, would we have got on without it? Yes, we would have. We would have existed without The Last of Us Part 1. We would have survived with The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Remastered is still a really beautiful rendition of the original game. And if you don't really care about all these improvements, or you don't even have a PlayStation 5, The Last of Us Remastered is still an incredible way to play this game. And if you have The Last of Us Remastered and you've played The Last of Us 5 or 6 times, you really don't need to pick up Part 1. But that Part 1 exists is, I think, important. I think it's something that needed to exist because now it's one. Part 1 and 2 is now one story. It's together. It looks the same. It feels the same. It is a collection of stories. It's a collection of brutality. It's a collection of all these things, and it's really impressive when you look at it on the whole. The question that has been asked since the announcement of Part 1, it's been asked of Naughty Dog, and it's been asked of the game itself. Is this just a shameless cash grab? And I can say with some certainty, no. This game was built with love and care and respect for the original game. The original game was so earth-shatteringly devastating. And it played in such a way that it genuinely made us all think, why do we need next-gen consoles? This is as good as it gets, and I'm fine with it. But when you look back on it, and you look back on what that game could have been, this is that game. This is what The Last of Us always could have been, and it is so impressive. It is so remarkable how much better this game looks to the original. And whereas most games, you don't really need it to look better for the game to be better, this is a game that hinges on the performances of the actors and the story that is being told. And any way for the story to be told in a more compelling, more advanced, more realistic and believable way is better. And Naughty Dog has done that. They have rebuilt this game from the ground up. They didn't just slap a new coat of paint on it. They didn't just look at some of the big parts and say, let's make those better, but, kind of forget the rest. Every element of this game has been touched in some way, improved in some way, and I think that it's a remarkable feat, and it's something that even if you don't care about The Last of Us, and even if you don't want to play Part 1, because you've already played The Last of Us a dozen times, you don't want to play it again. I think you still have to look at this and say, this is now for the legacy of this game. This is for the legacy of The Last of Us, the legacy of this series. A game series that has constantly pushed what consoles are capable of doing for some reason. Naughty Dog has been able to squeeze every ounce of power out of consoles before the consoles ride off into the sunset. It's also able to cement this game as genuinely one of the best. And now, it's so obvious. Whereas before, maybe you had to play the whole thing to really get it. Now you can just watch a clip and say, wow, that's impressive. The Last of Us Part 1 is a game that I didn't expect to like as much as I did, and I'm so glad that I was wrong.